So hello everybody and welcome to this RSA webinar. I'm Dr Meredith Dolg, President of the Rationalist Society, and the Rationalist Society is Australia's oldest free thought group. This meeting is taking place on the lands of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, and the RSA acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land and sea and community. Now, as you might have seen, this webinar is a very special one because it's our way of paying tribute to the extraordinary life of Dr Rodney Syme, who was, some of you may not realise, one of the Rationalist Society's patrons. Rodney, as most of you no doubt now know, died just last month after a mercifully short illness. And I knew him well because, as well as being president of the Rationalist Society, I'm a director of Dying with Dignity Victoria, and Rodney, of course, was at various times president, vice president, and just a director of Dying with Dignity. And I think the driving force of that organisation. And having seen him at work at various board meetings, I can really attest to his absolutely indefatigable spirit, as he fought for the right of people to die with dignity, those people that he saw as a doctor, he saw suffering intolerably at the end of their lives. So tonight we have two people who can bring you right up to date with how that fight is going. Dr Nick Carr is also a director of Dying with Dignity Victoria. And as a GP, he's been at the forefront of supporting his patients wanting to access VAD, so he can tell you about what that's actually like as it's implemented. As well as being a GP, Nick is a writer and a broadcaster, and as you'll hear from his accent, he's not from here. He trained in England and then moved to Melbourne in 1988. Now, he says, as a generalist, he has a wide variety of interests, but no special expertise in any of them. I'm not quite sure whether that's true, but still, that's what he says. He's published on a wide range of subjects, from sore throats to parenting, baby sleep programs, enemas, sport, benzodiazepines, psychosis, consumer issues, computers, COVID, euthanasia, and chicken bones. He appears regularly on ABC Radio Melbourne and Triple R, and he's also on television on Channel 7's House of Wellness, often with his older daughter, Isabel. He's a very proud dad. Penny Hackett is president of Dying with Dignity New South Wales, which is leading the VAD campaign in that state parliament. By background, she is a finance lawyer, but as you'll hear, she is currently and has for the last 4 years been devoting most of her time to advocate for assisted dying in New South Wales and in other states, supporting other states. And she also ran as a candidate in the Voluntary Euthanasia Party in the last New South Wales state election. Now, each of our speakers will speak for about 20 minutes, and then we'll have about 20 minutes for questions. I do try to wrap this up in an hour. We might go about 5 minutes over, but I'm very conscious that it's late-ish in the evening, so I don't want to drag this out, and you can go and enjoy the rest of your evenings. So I'm going to ask Nick to speak first. And Nick, would you like to just start by giving some reflections on your observation and experience of Rodney Syme?
Yeah, thank you very much, Meredith, and thanks very much to the RSA for inviting me to speak. And it is an incredible honour to be asked to give a brief tribute to Rodney. I came to Australia 34 years ago, and for about 33 and a half of those years, I heard the name Rodney Syme. but long before I met him, because it was so obvious this man was a champion advocating for the cause of euthanasia, as it was called back then, now voluntary assisted dying. And I remember meeting Rodney for the first time at my first Dying with Dignity board meeting in 2018. And by this stage, Rodney was well into his 80s. And oh my goodness, his energy, his enthusiasm, his absolute determination to effect change, and his incredible silver hair. There was so much about that man to admire and actually be envious of. So that was my first meeting with Rodney, and not too long after that, he eased back. He went back to live in the country and look after Meg, his wife. And to my absolute astonishment, I thought he was going to sort of quietly step aside. There's no stepping aside with Rodney. This barrage of emails kept coming, the phone calls in the evening, wanting to discuss yet another matter and consider what was going on. How do we support Mike Gaffney in Tasmania? And what are we going to do about West Australia? And Rodney always passionate about these causes. It was just, he was, and you used the word earlier, Meredith, and it's going to come up again, actually, indefatigable. That's what he seemed. And it was actually Andrew Denton who wrote a beautiful obituary about Rodney. So I'm going to use some of Andrew's words. And I think when Andrew wrote this, he must have recently read Richard Powers' fantastic novel Overstory, because Andrew gets a bit arboreal in this. But what he said about Rodney, and here's that word, Meredith, coming up again, he was indefatigable, unbreakable, or so it seemed. But now the mighty oak has fallen. There seems a vast empty space in the forest where he once stood, that familiar comforting shadow no longer cast. Beautifully put, Andrew. And it's so true, because for doctors like myself, Rodney was the person, he was that person who was just always there, who we could talk to about stuff, discuss stuff, who knew so much. But not just for us medical people, but of course, Rodney had helped so many people towards the end of their lives. He had counseled literally thousands of people. And just 2 or 3 months before he died, I was chatting with Rodney and I said to him, gee, Rodney, how many people did you actually help right at the end and give medication to? And he said, over 300. I mean, just absolutely astonishing what this man did, and the number of people that he helped. He was rightly recognized. He got the Humanist of the Year award in 2017. He got his AM in 2019. But I want to finish recognizing Rodney with Rodney's own words, because what Rodney said was, how we die is important. It is at the core of how our loved ones remember us. And as always with Rodney, he was absolutely spot on. So I want to remember Rodney as Andrew Denton did and say, R.I.P. Mighty Oak. So I've got to reset a little bit now, because I've got to talk about, now I'm going to talk about voluntary assisted dying here in Victoria. So bear with me a second while I just...
Take a glass of water, Nick.
Yeah,
it's very emotional remembering him.
Yeah, it is, isn't it? So I just want to run through a little bit what's been happening here in Victoria, the things that have been working, the things that maybe haven't worked quite so well, which also helps us think, I think, about how in other states developing voluntary assisted dying legislation, what can be improved. The Voluntary Assisted Dying Review Board released their report. The most recent one was at the second year after 2 years of operation. So that came out in June of this year. And in that report, just over 800 people had started the assessment process for voluntary assisted dying, and the number that worked their way through to the end and actually used the medication was just 331. So well under half the people who started the process completed the process with the medication. And if you put that in the context of how many people die every year in Victoria, it's over 40,000 people every year. So 331 in 2 years represents less than 0.5% of people who are dying, using voluntary assisted dying medication. So it's not exactly this avalanche of old people being carted out of nursing homes and bumped off by their greedy relatives that we were told was going to happen. There's just been no evidence of that happening whatsoever. And in fact, from my point of view, as a practitioner, there are lots of things about the experience that have worked incredibly well. The number one thing for me is something which I hadn't really expected, how potent going through this process is at helping relieve some of the suffering of people at the end of their lives. Even if they don't get to the point of getting the medication, just being engaged in the process, regaining some of that lost autonomy has been unbelievably helpful for not everybody, but a lot of people. And I don't think people quite realize they sort of talk about suffering at the end of life and pain and nausea and this sort of thing. Palliative care is great for that sort of stuff. It doesn't always work, of course, but mostly it works pretty well. But what people come to us for voluntary assisted dying, when they say, what are you suffering from? It's usually not pain or nausea or physical symptoms that are the top of their lists. What people tell us is the reason they want voluntary assisted dying is because of what we call this existential suffering. It's the loss of autonomy, the loss of control of body, that sense of, oh my God, death here could be horrible. And this gives me a choice about having something that is in my control at my time and not horrible. And that is an incredibly potent benefit that voluntary assisted dying brings, and way, way, way more important than I had ever realized before being part of this. Second thing I would say is that as a doctor, I mean, funny enough, as a doctor, you don't spend a lot of time with people actually at the point of dying. But I've been in the business for long enough. I've seen a lot of deaths, and I've seen some pretty okay deaths, and I've seen some pretty gruesome deaths over the years. What I have to say about a voluntary assisted dying death is it is so gentle. It is so peaceful. And the adjective that we keep using in the sort of VAD community, and I always feel I have to apologize for this because it feels sort of wrong at some level, but it seems beautiful. There is something so beautiful about someone having their wishes granted right at the end, being able to just make the choice, finish things comfortably, peacefully, in their own place at their own time. It's extraordinary. So that again is something which I hadn't expected. I hadn't realized just how potent that experience would be. We know from all the research that mostly voluntary assisted dying deaths are a pretty okay experience for family members. The research of bereavement, I mean, people are still bereaved, of course, but VAD deaths seem to work reasonably well for family members and don't leave people distressed or upset. I did have one woman, I rang her a few months after her partner took the drugs, and she said, no, it's still not okay for me. I still haven't come to terms with it. Whether she would have come to terms with him dying from his horrible neurological disorder, I don't know. The other thing that has perhaps slightly surprised me is how incredibly professionally rewarding it has been being involved in VAD care. The community of practice that we have, extraordinary, very supportive, small group of doctors involved in this area. But patients are supportive, my colleagues are supported. I've always been slightly surprised. My surgery hasn't been picketed. I don't have people chucking eggs at my car and calling me horrible names. In fact, the only horrible thing said about me on social media was by a psychiatrist who I thought I knew quite well. Turns out I didn't.
What did he say?
He accused me of all sorts of things. I think he had some religious underpinnings which I had somehow missed.
Right.
And the other thing in terms of positive, which I really want to mention, is the navigators, who are just incredible people. God, we love the navigators. I was talking to Susan again today. They have been an absolute godsend to the process. So wherever anyone does voluntary assisted dying type legislation, you must replicate the navigator type service. And if anyone listening to this doesn't know what I'm talking about and they're interested, they want more information, they don't know where to go for help, the voluntary assisted dying navigators, who are based at Peter MacCallum, and we now have rural and regional navigators in most areas, are your port of call. Fabulous, fabulous people. And the other shout out I want to give is to the statewide pharmacists who are based at the Alfred Hospital, who are incredible, empathic people. They go to anywhere in Victoria to deliver the medication. And they are so kind and so gentle with people. They spend so much time. They are a wonderful bunch. So that's all the good stuff. Now I'm going to give you the bad stuff. And I'm going to be quite quick because I could go on about this for a very long time, but I need to give Penny her time. A couple of things. We have in Victoria, you probably know what's called the gag clause. Doctors aren't allowed to raise voluntary assisted dying with patients. And what our experience is that most people who come to us are articulate, they're native English speakers, they're well educated because they've been able to find out about this. And we really worry about people from maybe less good English speaking backgrounds, more marginalized communities, people with less education. If they don't know about this and their doctor can't tell them, how will they know? So the gag clause is a big problem. WA ditched it, quite right too. We don't like the gag clause. The demographic requirements here in Victoria, you have to be an Australian citizen and a Victorian resident, but the citizenship has been interpreted as meaning you have to have taken the citizenship and have a passport or Australian residency, whereas that's not actually what it says in the legislation. I was talking to the navigators about this just this week, and we've had people who've been deemed ineligible, even though they've lived in this country. My very first patient, I've talked about this in the media before, Julian, pancreatic cancer, came to me 11 days after the law became able to be used. Everything was eligible, but his passport was British. And nothing we could do would change anything. And Julian was deemed ineligible, even though he'd paid taxes here, he'd retired, he was able to vote, he was getting a pension, everything else, but he was deemed ineligible. And Julian committed suicide in a really horrible way, exactly what our law was designed to prevent. And a too rigid interpretation of citizenship prevented him having it. A couple of other quick things. There are not enough doctors doing it. That's our fault. So persuade your GP or your specialist, whatever.
Ask the question.
Yeah, go to your, I don't believe a top down is going to work. It has to be people going to their own doctors and saying, I want you to help me with this. Telehealth, we're not allowed to talk about voluntary assisted dying over a carriage service, internet or telephone, because of a clash with the Commonwealth Criminal Codes Act 1995, which was not designed to have anything to do with voluntary assisted dying, but was interpreted here in Victoria as saying that we can't talk to people on the telephone or on the internet about VAD. We are taking steps to try and have that overturned. We've spent a long time writing to attorneys general and health ministers. But anyway, watch this space about telehealth. Finally, the remuneration. Oh my God, I'm lucky. I'm old. I don't have kids. I have to pay school fees and so on. But for young doctors, there's so much time in this. The Kiwis, what a great job they've done. You should see the remuneration support package they put in place. They say this will take time. It's difficult. We'll pay you for it. We should do that here in Australia as well. I'm going to stop there. That's my little take on where we're up to with VAD. I'll hand back to you. Thank you, Meredith.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Nick. Yes, big clap for Nick. Penny, I'm going to come to you now, and I know that you've been absolutely flat out. Tell us what's happening.
Well, if anyone was hoping for breaking news, you're in the right place, because we are right in the middle of our parliamentary debate, and I can see that we even have one of our board members here who is probably tuned in to find out what the hell's going on in New South Wales Parliament, and the answer is we're still not quite sure. I wanted to just start by acknowledging the unbelievable contribution that Rodney Syme made to our cause, and at the time that we heard of his illness and then death, we were in a bit of despair already ourselves, because we saw our bill being kicked into the long grass, and it was a bit of a body blow, because Rodney really, the words I used at the time were, we've lost our touchstone, and he really was for the cause across Australia. He was just a motivating person, continually everything came back to Rodney and Rodney's advocacy over really decades. And we would certainly not be in the position we're in now, with 5 states having passed laws, and fingers crossed New South Wales will hopefully crawl over the line at some point soon. But he kept everyone motivated, he kept us energised. And the word that I think mighty oak is a wonderful way to describe him, but I have always thought of him, the word I would use to describe him is brave, because he took incredible personal and professional risks for the benefit of other people and helping other doctors. But the care that he gave to the patients that sought his help was just unbelievable, and he really is a model of what a good doctor should be. He really was. So we recovered from that terrible blow of losing our touchstone. Fortunately, things have picked up a little bit in New South Wales. But before I get to what's actually going on, I'll just give you all a recap of how we got to where we are today. So I've been involved with Dying with Dignity since about 2015, and about that time was when Andrew Denton popped up out of the blue with his series Better Off Dead. And his aim, he always said that he wanted to light the fire, or light, there was a lot of tinder out there, someone needs to light the fire, and he well and truly lit that fire. Because prior to that, there'd been almost 50 attempts to get these laws passed in various jurisdictions around Australia. In the case of South Australia, I think they were up to number 17 before they finally got it through. And I'm sure all of you will know that we had the first assisted dying law in the world in the Northern Territory in the late 1990s, and that was pretty short-lived, unfortunately, but certainly gave us hope. And we certainly have Marshall Perrin, who may or may not be on this webinar. We have a great deal to thank him for as well. So after Andrew threw his Molotov cocktail into the tinder, a few things started happening. South Australia was always plugging away with a new bill, trying again. But the thing that really broke the dam, so to speak, was a parliamentary inquiry in Victoria. And during the process of that very lengthy and extremely detailed inquiry, I think Dan Andrews suffered the loss of his father, and until that time he had not realised why these laws were important. And that seems to be the case with a lot of people, but also a lot of legislators, that until they've had an experience themselves, they just do not understand why people are so passionate about this. So that resulted in a Victorian government bill, and there'd never been a government bill before, there'd always been private members' bills. And without going into too much detail, there was almost literally a bloodbath in Victorian Parliament getting it through, but they did just squeak in, and it was a lot of long nights and a lot of filibustering and a lot of crap. And I thought at one point we were going to see someone drop dead on the floor of Parliament, but they got it through. They had an orderly process of implementation, and now we've had a law functioning pretty well, subject to the comments that Nick has just made, but it's really demonstrated to the rest of the country that these laws are safe, effective, and unsurprisingly to us, there has not been a tsunami of death. So subsequently, there was Western Australia had its own extremely lengthy parliamentary inquiry, and once again, Mark McGowan had always been a strong supporter of assisted dying, and it was put forward as another Labor government bill, and a slightly easier passage, but still a fair bit of crap and a lot of very frustrating parliamentary processes, but they have now succeeded and implemented a law. It's been going for just a few months now, but it looks unsurprisingly again to be following the path of Victoria. So next Tasmania, the quiet achiever, and this was a massive achievement because it's been the first time a private member's bill managed to succeed, and we owe that to a lot of people were involved, but without the magic that is Mike Gaffney, I'm not sure it would have got through, because some private members are independents, are vexatious and not well liked in their parliaments, but everyone loves Mike, even the people that were vehemently opposed to this law. So the fact of having a great deal of goodwill really made an enormous difference in Tasmanian Parliament, but also it's a very small Parliament. So there were times when we were watching the Upper House debate and the chamber is so small that it looked like a group of people having a dinner party. So again, Mike's magic worked, and it wasn't easy, and there was a bit of crap, but things were helped very greatly by the Liberal Premier supporting the bill, and that really gave Liberals, who to date had been almost universally opposed to these laws, it was like giving them, those that wanted to vote for it previously were given permission because the Premier voted for it. Simultaneously with this, there was a parliamentary inquiry going on in Queensland. Again, another very lengthy, thousands of submissions, hours and hours of public hearings, terrible stories. And again, the culmination of that, and we have Labor to thank for producing 3 government bills in 3 states, and the Palaszczuk government agreed to put forward a government bill. Now, interestingly, in Queensland, they only have 1 chamber, so they didn't have the debacle that has been seen in other states' upper houses, which can be difficult beasts to wrangle. And it was a pretty civilised debate, and it was all over in 3, possibly 4 days, and a massive amount of work was done to get that through, because just because you have a government bill, it's still a conscience vote, and there are people within both parties who are very strongly opposed. But the passage of Tasmania and Queensland, I'll get back to South Australia in a minute, those processes that Queensland was going through, all of this provided a great deal of momentum for New South Wales. And South Australia, after many, many attempts, they had an inquiry, and they kept a bit of a low profile, I think, because they've put up bills and been disappointed so many times they perhaps weren't wanting to get their hopes up. But that was a private member's bill, given that Mike Gaffney kicked down the door for the private member's bill. It was a Labor MP who put forward a bill there. They had also the benefit of the Premier, Liberal Premier, supporting it. And again, a difficult process, but they achieved a wonderful result with a bigger majority. And that then leads me to New South Wales, which was described in the Australian as being the toughest nut to crack, and that may well prove to be true. Most outsiders would think that when you have every other state passing assisted dying laws, that it would be a foregone conclusion that it would pass in the last state, and particularly having 3 of those laws passed just this year and during the COVID crisis. We weren't naive. We knew it wouldn't be plain sailing, but we didn't quite expect it to be as difficult as it has been. So back to the start, we've had a few bills here. We had a bill put up in 2017, which was running almost neck and neck with the Victorian law, but we'd had no inquiry. It was, again, a private member's bill, and I think most people thought that it was just doomed to fail, so they didn't pay a great deal of attention to it. Now, we actually felt there was a lot of support in Parliament for it, but for a variety of reasons, it failed to pass in the upper house by just 1 vote. And we were very disappointed, but we were assured that it would be approached again after the next election. So we hopes up, we started planning and preparing, and then the election came, and it was decided that it would be a really good idea to deal with abortion reform first. Well, that almost brought down the government, with a handful of MPs threatening to leave the Liberal Party and go to the crossbench, and it was a really ghastly debate for everybody. It was across parties, across factions and friendships. It really caused a massive rift in New South Wales Parliament, and unfortunately for us, there was not the smallest appetite to proceed with another controversial piece of legislation, so we were kicked into the long grass again. Then we got to 2020, we thought maybe everything's died down, wounds have healed, perhaps we can see if we can find someone to put up another bill. Well, then there were bushfires, and shortly thereafter COVID, and the rest is history. So we were pretty despondent last year. We felt that there were so many obstacles in front of us and no appetite whatsoever to deal with assisted dying. And we went through a fair bit of navel gazing, and we decided that we could either sit around and wait till after 2023, or we could start rattling the cage, and that's what we decided to do. So we had we sort of grabbed Alex Greenwich by the head and put him in a headlock and said, we need you to put this bill up, or else. And we started actively campaigning and making a bit of noise, and we started a petition, and Alex, to his credit, agreed that the time was right to start the process, and we knew it was going to be a lengthy process. So in December last year, we launched our petition asking for Parliament, New South Wales Parliament, to work together to get this done. At that point, it was only Western Australia and Victoria that had passed laws. And the process worked very slowly. There was flagging and foreshadowing, there was softening up, there was discussions in Parliament, there was talk of, is the time right, that sort of thing. And Alex just proceeded methodically to develop a bill. He had it prepared by the parliamentary draftsman. He made statements of intention, so everyone knew what was coming. I think many of them hoped that it wasn't coming, but there was no one that could say that they did not expect a private member's bill to come forward at some point. All of this time, we were madly campaigning on the ground, and it was just a colossal effort trying to do grassroots campaigning. We held 50-something community stalls, and we're planning to get to 100 until COVID lockdowns came along again. But we collected in hard copy over 16,000 signatures on a petition, and online we ended up, I think, with 106,000. Most of that was through social media, which I've now become, I'm not going to say a guru, but more involved and more experienced than I ever thought I would be in terms of advertising on Facebook and that sort of thing. But we used a lot of interesting tools and platforms, and one thing which was incredibly, well, there's a couple of things that were very powerful, but one thing in particular was a platform which I'm sure many of you have used something similar as part of various campaigns, but sending a platform that enables you to find who your MP is. The most important thing in any of these campaigns is constituents contacting MPs, but that's actually quite hard if you have to track them down on parliamentary websites. So this portal enabled us to very easily get people to write often very personal messages about loved ones, and I've read all of them. We've had over 26,000, and they've all come through my mailbox in the last 4 years, and some of them are just devastating, and I find it hard to believe any MP could not just automatically vote for this law. So where we are now is that a bill has been introduced. There have been various upheavals and threats of delay, and we had to make an enormous fuss and threaten to make a lot of noise at by-elections, and get involved in the political process. And obviously our Parliament did not sit for a very long period of time. So now we are in the middle of a debate. In fact, they may well be debating as we speak. At this point, we are confident that there are the numbers to have the bill passed in the lower house. There's a parliamentary inquiry which is running now, and that will have hearings during December, and it's due to report at the start of February. But we are at this point in time at the most dangerous point in the debate, because it's the process of amendments where people who would never vote for this bill are putting up literally hundreds of amendments. And some of those are designed to just waste time and ensure that it can't get done this year, and others are very cynically designed to make the law very difficult to use. For example, putting back in the clauses that Nick has spoken about in terms of not mentioning doctors not being able to talk to people about VAD, or other things that they've come up with on their own, like requiring multiple extra consultations. And I would be surprised if someone doesn't come up with the requirement for a legal panel to assess capacity and things. And all of these are designed to just make it too bloody hard for people to use. And amendments are just dribbling in. I've seen a few more come in. Any MP can raise any amendment at any time, including on the floor of Parliament. And we don't know whether that will happen tomorrow or Friday. If it's not all done by Friday, then it will be just dragging on into next year. We've seen the usual, when I described crap before, some of the crap that's come through today is an amendment to change the name of the bill to the Assisted Suicide and Euthanasia Bill. And someone else wants to change the description of the assisted dying substance to be the assisted dying poison. So that will give you the flavour of the sort of rubbish that is going on. I am scheduling a small nervous breakdown for myself on Saturday, because I think these next 3 days are going to be amongst the most stressful of my life. So I'll leave it at that. And
Penny, can I just ask, who leads the rebuttal of each of these amendments?
To be honest, I'm not quite sure, because everything is completely different when it's a conscience vote. So there are no standing orders. And also this bill has 28 co-sponsors, including someone from the Shooters and Fishers and Greens and all parties, including Liberals. So potentially any of them could rebut, and it's going to be a moving feast, and we're just going to have to see what happens. So if anyone's got nothing better to do for the next 2 days, if you want to see how laws are made, then you can tune into New South Wales Lower House.
And Penny, do you know whether those 28 co-sponsors are actually coordinating with one another at all?
I'm sure they are. Because we can't add anything to the process that's going on, other than to give our experience of how things have unfolded in other debates. And they're working very closely with Go Gentle, because they have been literally in the chamber in some instances in some of those other debates. So we are taking a little bit of a back step. We're the ones that are getting our 100,000 supporters to send annoying emails to their MPs. And we had a little rally outside someone's electorate office on Monday, which was not very well received, but it was important to send a message. So we're leaving Go Gentle to, now it's time for them to really show the benefit of them having been involved with pretty much all of the debates. Yeah. And we'll probably we will watch on in horror.
Yeah. And when you do win it, being very positive here, when you do win it, you can make a little speech and dedicate its achievement to Rodney Syme.
His contribution is immeasurable, and we will never forget what he's done for the cause and for the people that are going to use this law.
So the first question is from John Goldsmith, and I think I'll direct this one to you, Nick. He says, are there any changes needed to the Victorian legislation to make it more user-friendly?
Yeah, so this is going to take the rest of this webinar. I mean, it's a great question, and it goes back to what I said earlier. We need to remove the gag clause. We need to make prognosis less of an issue. That's a huge impediment, because at the moment people listening probably realize that you have to have a prognosis of less than 6 months or 12 months if it's a neurodegenerative disorder. And we doctors, we're absolutely bloody hopeless at this. We have no idea about prognosis anyway, but doctors are not prepared to say when someone's not doing too badly, well, you may have 6 months to live. And we often say no one's ever told they've got 6 months to go until, in fact, they've got 6 weeks to go. So the prognosis side of things has been quite a barrier for a lot of people because they come to the process too late. The other thing that would certainly facilitate going through this is having a simplified process. Penny, you've said that they're trying to obfuscate and make it a more complicated process in New South Wales. It takes a long time. It takes a lot of guts and determination, a lot of visits to doctors at the moment. It's not an easy process. And I would hope that at some point, I suspect it'll be in the distant future, we won't make it quite so onerous on people who are suffering at the end of their lives, to make it quite so difficult to go through it. I'll stop at that.
So I think the short answer is yes.
Yeah.
And just to assure John, Dying with Dignity Victoria is putting together a comprehensive submission which will go to the legislated 5-year review of the Victorian legislation. That's not for a couple of years, but that's the time at which we can, having gathered evidence about how this is being implemented, we will put in a very strong submission seeking improvements to the Victorian legislation. Here's a question from Jeffrey Williams, and Penny, I think this one's for you. Jeffrey says, the Premier said in Parliament today, well, that was when he asked the question, that improved palliative care is all that's necessary. What are the latest figures available to counter this argument, which is typically used by the opponents to VAD?
It is quite difficult to get specific figures on how many people palliative care doesn't work that well for. But I think we know it's a relatively small number. Where we're at in the parliamentary process is that opponents will universally say no one dies badly when they've got access to palliative care. Therefore, all we need is more and better palliative care and the problem will go away. Well, unfortunately, that's not the case, and people that are honest will acknowledge that. But in some ways, you might say that this debate about assisted dying is the best thing that ever happened to palliative care, because their profile has been massively lifted. Everyone is talking about it, and pretty much in every state where there's been a debate about VAD, there has been an increase in funding. And we wholeheartedly support that. It's imperative that there be excellent palliative care and delivered in ways that are not just through specialist units, but by GPs and nurse practitioners and community nurses. It's just vital. But the fact remains that some people still have shocking deaths and will continue to do so, even under the care of the top palliative care specialists. So, Jeffrey, I can't give you specific numbers, but I think the UTAS report, which was done as part of the Victorian legislation, suggested that somewhere between 10 and 20% of people had symptoms that couldn't be adequately relieved. We've seen various other numbers between sort of 4 and 8. But whichever way you cut it, it is a significant but important minority of people.
And Nick, I think it's true that most people who do access VAD or who indicate that they wish to go through the process, they're already in palliative care, are they not?
Well, they don't have to be in palliative
No.
care, but part of the assessment process requires us to discuss palliative care with people. If they don't have it, why not? And to facilitate their access to palliative care and improve palliative care if it's not working for them. So it's very much a hand-in-hand process with VAD.
All right. Let's move on to the next question. This is from Robin Maggs. And Nick, maybe one for you. Why is the issue of organ donation and VAD being avoided in Australia, except for Nick Carr's recent article?
And I think there was a writer saying it seems to be working elsewhere without a problem.
Yes.
And I'm not sure that it's being avoided. I think we've been struggling so much with the implementation of VAD and making it happen that at the moment it just feels a little bit too hard to struggle with the incredibly complex question of organ donation. Just for people watching who wonder what on earth we're talking about, because you'll probably be aware that if you die from a malignancy, then your organs can't be donated in terms of solid organs. But neurodegenerative disorders, of course, you may have perfectly good hearts and lungs and kidneys and so on. And the push overseas has come from people dying of those sorts of disorders who say, I don't want to waste them. I'm going to die. My neurological disorder is awful, but I want my organs used. And particularly in Belgium, they have set up processes where this can happen. But it requires an incredible coordination between transplant teams and the doctors working in voluntary assisted dying. I'm hoping that this is something that we will begin the conversation about and begin working on. I'm sorry to say to the person asking the question, we're certainly not there yet, but watch this space, we will work on it.
Okay, thank you. A two-part question from Neil Francis. Firstly, for you, Penny. Neil says, an enormous amount of hard work has gone into the New South Wales law reform effort from a wide range of people and organisations. What effect has there been on these efforts, would you say, by the relatively new ability to tell each member of the New South Wales Parliament exactly what proportion of their own constituents support the reform?
Well,
the actual numbers.
This is the point at which I need to thank Neil for his marvellous help. So it's been the case for a very long time that independent polls always show a huge majority of people support VAD, and that's been increasing steadily. Now, as we know, these sort of polls, which some people will swear black and blue by when it comes to replacing a prime minister, will, when they're looking at a voluntary assisted dying law, will claim that the sample size is microscopic and it's not representative and that sort of thing. So despite everybody knowing that the numbers are sound, we would have MPs saying, well, my electorate's different. So what we did, and it took a long time, but I'm sure most of you will be familiar with the ABC Vote Compass surveys that they've conducted at the last couple of federal elections. And it has a massive sample size, and they ask a very large number of questions, and they've always had a question on voluntary assisted dying. And I always thought we need to get access to that underlying data and look into it in more detail. Could not work out how to help to find it. So finally tracked it down to a research group in Canada, and Neil and I wrangled to buy the data and adjust it for the VAD question by postcode, and Neil managed to get information from the electoral commissions to map that against all the lower house electorates in the country. So we managed to produce a marvellous looking little graph for every lower house electorate, 400 and something of them, which showed the MP the number of respondents, which in some cases was nearly 3,000. It had the range of support, oppose, and in between. It was also broken down by voting intention and by religion. And it was just staggeringly clear from that data that everyone, everywhere, sorry, not everyone, but every MP in every electorate has a substantial majority. And the lowest was 64% in, probably unsurprisingly, the western suburbs of Sydney, and the highest was, I think, inner city Melbourne at 86%. And there was a reasonable proportion of undecideds and no response, but somewhere between sort of 6 and 15% of people actively opposed. So it was just incontrovertible evidence. Of course, some of them are claiming that it was the ABC, so it was a bunch of lefties, and the data wasn't sound and all that sort of thing. But we sent, in New South Wales, every MP was sent several times a copy of this, gorgeous looking graph, along with a link to comparisons showing how they ranked with other electorates. And I think that made a really big difference. A lot of MPs have referred to it in their speeches. And I think for some, it gave them the ability to say, I might not support this myself, but I know my community wants it, and I've seen the evidence of it. So it was just a lot of work, and thank you, Neil, but it really, brought home, hopefully will bring home the bacon.
Indeed. And the second of that two-part question from Neil, but this one's to Nick. Nick, to what degree in your VAD consulting experience do family members and friends who are in principle opposed to VAD, to what extent do they try to persuade people out of it?
Yeah, again, great question, Neil. I've been through this a couple of times. I haven't been involved in huge numbers, probably about 35 cases involving VAD, and more than that who haven't actually gone down the path, but I've talked about it. And the number of people who've had members of family who were opposed has been actually tiny. Part of the process is we do talk to people about talking to families. So we make it very clear that for this process to work well, it is crucial that people talk to their family members. So we do make sure people are aware of the importance of that. I had one very complicated woman who had an adult child who had a very strong Catholic belief. She was a medical practitioner herself, and she also happened to suffer from schizophrenia. So it was a slightly complicated combination. But what was interesting was that we just spent a lot of time talking to her with her mum, and she came around to the fact that this was what her mum's wishes were. And so in the end, as with most things, enough talking, enough consideration, and enough connection, it's usually resolvable. Mm.
But we don't have any statistics about something like this.
It's not something which is recorded anywhere in the portal or anything like that, no. So I'm just giving you anecdote, I'm afraid.
Sure, okay. Thank you. There's a question from Gwyneth Anderton, and maybe, Nick, this one's for you. Does a certificate of Australian citizenship suffice instead of an actual passport?
Yes.
So, because that's evidence that you are an Australian citizen, and that's what you need to produce.
Passport or citizenship. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Question from Kevin Powell. How does the medication end your life?
So the standard is that you have to drink or swallow the medication, and you only get practitioner administration if you're unable to swallow or absorb. So nearly everybody, as mentioned in the figures earlier, of the 331, it was the overwhelming majority drank the medication. It's a very potent barbiturate. It's the same barbiturate that's used by the vets. And what it does is put you to sleep, and then it affects the respiratory centers so that you just stop breathing. That process is slow, gentle, and the breathing center literally just slowly shuts down. People go from deep sleep to deep coma to death.
When you say slow, how slow or fast?
One of the things we tell families is it's very variable. So the quickest I've seen is someone went from swallowing the thing and saying goodbye to being dead was 25 minutes. I've sat with someone for over 6 hours. He was absolutely fine. I mean, he was just breathing very, very shallowly at increasingly long intervals over a very long period of time. But we warn families about this because it can be a bit distressing to sit there wondering, is dad actually dead? Is dad okay? Well, dad's absolutely fine. Dad's comatose. I always say to the person who's going to take the medication, once you go to sleep, you will not know any more about this. You will not experience anything. You'll go sleep, coma, and eventually death. But family members need to know it can actually be quite a long, drawn-out process. The 6-hour patient, the family sat around drinking a lot of wine, but I had to sit there watching them do that and sip on the soda water because I was still being a doctor at that point.
And Nick, is there any chance that the medication would not result in the person dying?
And the dose that we used was described by the visiting Canadians as, my God, that's humongous. It is a very large dose of medication. And even if people regurgitate a bit, which has happened sometimes, no one has not died from it. It always works.
Right. Susan Bendel, again, possibly for you, Nick, what can those of us who do not fall within the narrow definition of the law, what can we do?
So obviously that's a very broad question because the definition is terminal illness, prognosis less than 6 months. You've got to have capacity to give instruction. So there are lots of reasons why you might not qualify, and it could be around disease, it could be around prognosis, it could be around capacity. So I'm not quite sure which one you're asking about there. What we would say is that, don't forget, the voluntary assisted dying is only for a relatively small group of people with terminal disease at the end of their lives. What we should all do, particularly if we don't qualify, is make sure our advanced care directives are in place, make sure that our medical treatment decision makers are appointed, so that we have an end-of-life plan. And if voluntary assisted dying is not something we either choose to or are able to access, we should make our wishes abundantly clear in those documents.
And I'm just going to ask one more question, and then I think we need to wrap up. Heather McNamee asks, has the federal government been approached to look at a possible Medicare item numbers? We managed to get specific item numbers for abortion, telehealth consults, amazingly. So COVID seems to have made getting new item numbers easier.
Short answer, no. I mean, obviously, it only began in Victoria. Federal government has no interest in funding GPs for almost anything if they don't have to, and they're certainly not going to fund us for VAD care as far as I can make out.
Right. Everybody, we're going to call it a day now and wrap this up. Just to let you know, the RSA has been running these webinars on a monthly basis. We're going to take a break over the summer and be back next year in February. And we're going to rebrand ourselves. Some of you may know that we have launched a new online magazine, and we're calling it Rationale. So in order to complement the online magazine Rationale, which has our longer form articles about philosophy, about psychology, law, politics, science, medicine, health, as well as religion and ethics, we are going to call this webinar series from 2022 the Rationale webinar series. So watch out for it, but in February of next year. With that, if everybody knows how to do this, down the bottom of your Zoom screen, there's a little reactions button. If you could click on that and click on the clapping hands to say thank you to our two wonderful guests, Dr. Nick Carr and Penny Hackett. And Penny, we are rooting for you, so all the very best in the future.